Lewis Hamilton lashes out at Ferrari after losing his shot at the podium at Silverstone in front of his home fans. Don't miss the full story of his furious reaction, especially towards Frédéric Vasseur and Charles Leclerc. Lewis Hamilton charged down the paddock like a force of nature, still fully geared, visor down, helmet strapped tight, not out of oversight, but because the inferno of emotion surging through him rendered every secondary concern meaningless. His fists clenched by his sides, arms stiff as steel, jaw tightened behind the carbon fiber casing. He was a man on the brink, not of collapse but eruption. He didn't speak. He didn't make eye contact. He didn't offer even the slightest nod to the Mercedes crew, many of whom reached out in vain, calling his name, trying to offer words of comfort, to cool the fire that clearly raged inside him. His silence was louder than any outburst, and his body language screamed betrayal, humiliation, and something far more dangerous, vengeance. The paddock, usually a noisy hive of clattering tools and background chatter, fell into a stunned hush as he passed. Even the media stood still, microphones lowered, unsure whether this was the moment to document or simply step back and watch history smolder. And at the center of this internal storm stood a single name, Charles Leclerc. The driver Hamilton had previously praised for his tenacity, his finesse in wheel-to-wheel combat, and his potential to shape the next generation of Formula One. But on this particular Sunday, under storm clouds that mirrored the chaos below, Leclerc had made a misjudgment that would redefine his relationship with Hamilton for the foreseeable future. The incident had occurred mid-race, just as the strategic complexity of the Grand Prix was reaching its zenith. Rain had begun to fall, not in sheets but in an unpredictable, uneven mist that turned corners treacherous and reduced visibility to a blur of blinking rain lights. Teams scrambled. Data changed lap by lap. Decisions were being made under immense pressure, balancing instinct with analytics, fear with ambition. Mercedes, always pragmatic, opted to pit both drivers for full wet tires, a conservative move but a wise one, as the radar indicated heavier rain was approaching fast. Ferrari, however, perhaps feeling the urgency of their lackluster season and desperate to reclaim some glory, rolled the dice. They kept Charles Leclerc out one lap longer, then called him in for intermediates, despite track conditions rapidly deteriorating. It was a risky strategy based not on current grip levels, but on a hopeful forecast that the rain would ease. But forecasts don't win races. Execution does. And on lap 37, as Hamilton was closing in on the back of Leclerc's Ferrari, the gamble backfired spectacularly. Approaching turn 7, a downhill braking zone notorious for punishing any lack of precision, Leclerc, struggling to find traction on his intermediates, hit the brakes just a fraction too late. His rear tires locked. The car fishtailed, then spun uncontrollably across the apex of the corner, its rear end snapping outward like a pendulum. Hamilton, tucked behind in pursuit, had absolutely nowhere to go. Traveling at high speed in limited visibility, he was forced to swerve sharply to avoid a collision, sliding over the runoff and losing nearly 6 seconds in the process. The evasive maneuver shattered not just his lap time, but the carefully constructed rhythm of his entire race. That moment, those few chaotic seconds, undermined what had until then been one of Hamilton's finest performances of the season. He had been managing his tires with the grace of a veteran and hunting down his rivals with cold, calculated patience. Prior to the incident, telemetry showed that Hamilton was lapping significantly faster than the frontrunners, and Mercedes' strategy team had already begun discussing a potential undercut that could leapfrog him into second place. The podium, once a tangible reality, dissolved instantly. In the chaos, Nico Hülkenberg, who had quietly capitalized on earlier pit strategies and maintained solid pace in worsening conditions, slipped through the carnage, clean and calm, to snatch what would become his first ever podium in Formula One. It was a fairy tale moment for the German driver, but for Hamilton, it was a living nightmare unfolding in real time. Inside the Mercedes garage, reactions were split between disbelief and despair. Engineers stared at their screens in stunned silence. Radio communications buzzed with expletives. James Allison stood frozen, headset in hand, unable to respond to what he was witnessing. Toto Wolff, who had been tracking Hamilton's sector times with growing excitement, removed his glasses and sat down without saying a word. The race wasn't just lost. It had been sabotaged, unintentionally perhaps, but effectively. The paddock, as always, tried to move on. But not Hamilton. Not this time. When he finally reappeared before the media, Hamilton's face was devoid of expression, his voice measured but filled with barbed undertones. His words were chosen carefully, each one dipped in venom, not to provoke, but to clarify his contempt. "I've raced long enough to know when someone makes a genuine mistake," he said slowly, gazing straight ahead, "and when someone gambles with other people's races. Today, we saw the latter." Reporters leaned forward, knowing that behind those calm sentences were infernos of emotion. When asked whether he had spoken to Leclerc, Hamilton shook his head curtly. "What's there to say? You can't unspin a car." In the Ferrari garage, the mood was tense. Leclerc, visibly upset, tried to explain himself, citing tire temperatures, brake balance, and lack of rear downforce as contributing factors. But even his tone carried guilt, frustration, and something close to shame. He apologized to the team, to the fans, but not to Hamilton. That omission did not go unnoticed. Social media erupted. Pundits debated blame. Was it an honest mistake or reckless risk-taking? Should the FIA have intervened? Should Leclerc have been penalized for rejoining unsafely? The stewards ultimately ruled it a racing incident. But for Hamilton, who had been robbed of a potential 25-point swing in the championship standings, it felt like a gross miscarriage of justice. Back in the confines of the Mercedes motorhome, Lewis sat alone in the debriefing room, replaying the onboard footage over and over again. He watched Leclerc lose control in slow motion. He watched his own swerve into the runoff. He watched Hülkenberg sail by like a ghost. Every frame etched itself into his memory. It wasn't just the points. It was the message that you can do everything right, execute perfectly, and still be derailed by another man's gamble. And what haunted him more than anything was the realization that this wasn't just about a race. It was about reputation, legacy, momentum. Every lost podium, every missed opportunity added weight to the narrative that Hamilton was nearing the twilight of his career. And that was something he would not accept, not quietly. What emerged from that silence wasn't just bitterness. It was resolve. A kind of raw, unfiltered determination that had once fueled his rise from a Stevenage council estate to the top of motorsport. If Leclerc's spin had been the catalyst, then what came next would be the consequence. Hamilton began preparing, not just physically, but psychologically. He requested extra simulator sessions. He met with strategists daily. He stayed late into the night reviewing every corner of the next track. Because now it wasn't just about winning. It was about redemption. About proving that even when the universe conspires against him, he remains the most formidable competitor on the grid. And though the headlines would read Hülkenberg finally gets his podium, the real story, the one whispered through paddocks and engineering rooms, was about what Hamilton would do next. Because when you ignite the fire in a 7-time world champion, what follows is never just a comeback. It's a reckoning. Lewis had absolutely no alternative. In that harrowing instant, pure reflex took over. Years of elite experience, racing instincts honed through countless battles, kicked in with ferocious urgency. His right foot crashed down onto the brake pedal with an intensity that wasn't calculated. It was survival. The Mercedes lunged forward, its tires skimming over a layer of treacherous, rain-slicked tarmac. Hydroplaning seemed inevitable. The car jolted, shuddered, and for a split second, it felt as if the laws of physics were playing dice with his life. He didn't think. He reacted. The front wing of his W15 came within centimeters, if not millimeters, of impaling the rear diffuser of Charles Leclerc's Ferrari. It was so close, the telemetry barely captured the margin. One false twitch, one heartbeat of hesitation, and they both would have been out. But Hamilton, by some miracle, a blend of instinct, spatial awareness, and sheer grit, kept it out of the wall, out of Leclerc's rear end, and barely in the race. Yet the cost was devastating. The violent deceleration in the apex of a high-speed sector, especially under wet and unstable conditions, created the worst possible scenario: complete vulnerability. He lost momentum, lost grip, and most painfully, lost positions. Two predators in the mist behind him were waiting. Lando Norris in the McLaren, and Nico Hülkenberg in the Haas. Yes, Hülkenberg, the man long mocked as Mr. Almost Podium, pounced like wolves sensing blood in the water. They darted past him with ruthless precision, taking advantage of the split-second chaos. Lewis could only watch their taillights disappear into the rain, and with them, any realistic shot at the podium. And it was in that exact moment, a handful of seconds, a blur of speed, noise, spray, and heartbreak, that Hamilton's vision for the weekend collapsed entirely. His plan, his recovery strategy, all of it incinerated by the consequence of someone else's mistake. He'd fought through tire degradation, mastered sector splits in deteriorating conditions, and crafted a race that was supposed to end in redemption. Instead, he was staring down the barrel of mediocrity. But what truly pierced him wasn't Lando. Norris was expected to be quick in those conditions. The McLaren team had executed a perfect tire transition. It made sense. Logical. Digestible. But Nico Hülkenberg? That was a different beast. That stung. Because this wasn't just about losing a position, it was about legacy. Nico, a man who had driven more races than most on the grid yet had never, in over a decade of trying, stood on the podium, was now ahead of Lewis Hamilton, a 7-time world champion, a living icon, a generational talent. To have that particular name flash ahead on the leaderboard wasn't merely frustrating, it was insulting. Not because Nico didn't deserve respect, but because in Hamilton's mind, this shouldn't have been a fight at all. And the reason it was a fight came down to Ferrari's catastrophic misjudgment. As he crossed the finish line under the checkered flag, Hamilton felt no closure. No sense of completion. Only boiling injustice. He didn't acknowledge his race engineer's calm post-race voice. He ignored every procedural instruction. He didn't unbuckle his helmet. He didn't exhale. Instead, he climbed out of the car like a soldier returning from a battlefield. Not victorious, not defeated, but furious. Enraged. And ready for confrontation. What followed was unprecedented. Rather than returning to the Mercedes garage to debrief with his engineers, something that every professional driver does without exception, Lewis walked away. Past the camera crews, past the PR handlers, past Toto Wolff's frantic gestures to call him back. Still in his racing suit, gloves soaked with sweat and rain, helmet still on, visor halfway down, Lewis cut a path through the paddock like a man on a mission. He wasn't seeking clarity. He wasn't chasing a statement. He was heading straight into enemy territory. And everyone knew it. The cameras locked onto him instantly. This wasn't just post-race frustration. This was the start of something bigger. The crowd parted. Team officials froze. Lewis Hamilton was storming straight into Ferrari's hospitality motorhome, and no one was stopping him. The tension in the paddock was electric, like a live wire humming through the air. Every step he took became global news. Journalists whispered in disbelief. Even his fiercest critics held their breath. You don't march into another team's headquarters unless something has gone terribly wrong, or unless you're ready to ignite a war. Inside the luxurious confines of the Ferrari suite, where usually champagne flutes clink and executives shake hands with sponsors, chaos was brewing. Frederic Vasseur, team principal of the Scuderia, had just started debriefing with his staff about the decision to gamble with Leclerc's tires when the door slammed open. The room turned to ice. And in stormed Hamilton. He didn't wait for pleasantries. He didn't sit. He didn't remove his helmet. He launched. His voice, muffled slightly by the carbon fiber of his helmet, was still unmistakably furious. He didn't accuse Ferrari of being slow. He accused them of being dangerous. He demanded to know why Leclerc had been kept out on intermediate tires long after radar clearly showed worsening rain patterns. Why risk it? Why endanger not only their own driver, but every car around him? Why gamble on safety in a sport where milliseconds matter and lives hang by threads? People present later described the confrontation as volcanic. Hamilton reportedly slammed his gloves onto the nearest table and pointed directly at Vasseur, calling the team's strategy negligent, amateur, and reckless beyond belief. He claimed that Leclerc's spin, caused by aquaplaning while still on inters, was not a racing incident, but a predictable outcome of Ferrari's blind stubbornness. And because of that spin, Hamilton was forced into evasive action, compromising his position and unraveling a carefully orchestrated race strategy that had taken him from P9 to fighting for a podium. Vasseur attempted to de-escalate. He offered explanations. The forecast changed, Leclerc insisted, they didn't want a double stack, there was traffic in the pit lane. But none of it mattered to Lewis. Because in that moment, it wasn't about data. It was about principle. Hamilton made it clear, his voice echoing off the pristine white walls of the suite, that elite motorsport isn't just about risk. It's about knowing which risks are worth taking. And Ferrari, he said, had gambled with the lives of others. He accused them of forgetting what Formula One is at its core, a high-speed symphony of engineering, precision, and responsibility. And in his view, they had desecrated that. Perhaps most shocking was how personal it became. Hamilton referenced past incidents, Baku, Brazil, Silverstone, where Ferrari's decisions had spiraled into chaos not just for them, but for others. He asked if they had learned anything. He told them their recklessness was becoming systemic, and that today, it had come at his expense. Again. Then, just as suddenly as he had arrived, he turned and left. No handshake. No apology. No softening of tone. He exited the Ferrari motorhome as hundreds of Paddock members watched in stunned silence. His steps were slower now. Not because he was tired, but because the weight of what had just occurred was immense. This wasn't just a post-race outburst. This was a statement. A declaration. A warning. Social media exploded within seconds. Hashtags trended globally. Speculation swirled. Was this the moment Hamilton severed any ties with a future at Ferrari? Was this his final act of defiance before announcing something monumental? Or was it merely a boiling point? Years of frustrations at race management, FIA inconsistency, rival team incompetence, finally spilling over? Whatever the answer, one truth became crystal clear across the motorsport world. Lewis Hamilton was done being polite. He was done playing the diplomat. He had been robbed again, and this time, he wasn't going to take it silently. And as the paddock returned to its rhythm, still shaken by what they'd witnessed, there was only one consensus. This was not the end of the drama. If anything, it was only the prologue. Frederic Vasseur, typically the embodiment of serenity amidst the storm, had finally reached his breaking point. The man who usually managed chaos with a quiet authority and a half-smile now stood at the center of a volatile storm, his voice raised and his hands clenched tightly against the table, as if physically restraining the avalanche of frustration building inside him. What had started as a post-race debrief quickly unraveled into an emotionally charged confrontation between two world-class drivers, and their furious team boss caught in the middle. Vasseur didn't waste a second defending his position. With his tone sharpened and jaw tight, he outlined the team's logic behind the tire decision. According to the data coming into the garage, and based on continuous input from Charles Leclerc on track, the weather system appeared unpredictable. The radar images didn't show an immediate downpour. Instead, the storm was stalling, potentially veering off course. Ferrari strategists had concluded that there was a small high-reward window in which Charles could stay out longer on slicks before switching to intermediates, possibly leapfrogging several rivals during the chaos of pit stops. Leclerc himself had reportedly indicated that grip levels were tolerable and that there was still a dry racing line in certain sections. He had voiced cautious optimism that he could hold position or even gain ground if the rain didn't intensify immediately. Vasseur emphasized this point repeatedly, visibly frustrated that people were painting the call as reckless when, from their perspective, it had been calculated risk-taking based on up-to-the-second analysis. But none of this placated Lewis Hamilton. The seven-time world champion, now embroiled in a razor-thin title fight, wasn't in the mood for explanations. His championship campaign, meticulously built through consistency, resilience, and tireless precision, had taken another hit because of what he saw as a poorly timed and unnecessary gamble by a teammate. Leaning forward, eyes blazing, Hamilton cut Vasseur off mid-sentence, his voice seething with rage. "You call that calculated? That wasn't strategy, that was desperation," he hissed. "That move didn't just cost Charles his race, it dragged me down with it." Hamilton slammed his palm onto the polished table surface, the loud impact startling some of the personnel in the room. The shockwave from his anger was palpable. He wasn't just angry, he was betrayed. Betrayed by the people whose job it was to protect his title chances. Betrayed by a teammate whose mistake had forced him into unscheduled pit stops and left him vulnerable to undercuts by rivals. The chain reaction had cost him track position, momentum, and possibly the entire trajectory of his championship battle. And then, almost on cue, Charles Leclerc stepped into the room. Still wearing his fireproof undershirt, helmet tucked under one arm, water dripping from his suit, and shoulders sagging with exhaustion, Leclerc looked like a man carrying the weight of the race on his back. He entered cautiously, hearing the echo of raised voices before even crossing the threshold. But as soon as Hamilton's eyes met his, the tension escalated tenfold. "You knew the track was getting worse," Hamilton began, his tone cutting and relentless. "You felt it in the car. So why didn't you pit? Why did you stay out and gamble with everyone else's race too?" Charles raised both hands, his voice low and measured, trying to inject calm into a room already past its boiling point. "I said it was slippery. I said it was starting to go," he began, choosing his words carefully. But I also said I could maybe hold on for another lap or two. They told me we'd wait. That the rain would delay. I went with their call. I didn't push for it. I trusted them. That admission landed with a dull thud in the room. Charles wasn't denying the mistake. He was admitting that he'd been complicit in it. That he'd gone along with the plan even when his gut was whispering otherwise. Hamilton's eyes widened, disbelief now replacing rage. You trusted them more than your own instincts, he spat. You knew you were on the edge. You told them it was wet, but you stayed out. What the hell were you thinking, Charles? That kind of decision doesn't just affect you anymore. We're in this together now. One mistake and we both pay for it. Leclerc's exhaustion vanished in a flash of anger. Don't talk to me like I don't care, he snapped back, stepping closer. You think I enjoyed spinning out? You think I don't give a damn about points? About results? I was driving blind, on tires that gave me nothing. I had zero traction. I was doing everything I could just to keep it on the track. I made the best call I could in that moment with the information I had. But it wasn't good enough, Hamilton shot back. You're not racing just for yourself anymore. Every lap you take has implications for me, for the team, for the constructors' standings. I expect better from someone wearing the same overalls as me. You expect perfection from everyone but yourself, Charles retorted bitterly. You make aggressive moves, you force others off the line, and you demand the world to bend around your title fight. But when I follow the team's instructions, you act like I sabotaged your career on purpose. Voices were raised again, louder than ever. The entire technical team was now frozen in place, unsure if they were witnessing a fallout or the beginning of an implosion. Data analysts, tire technicians, and engineers stood silently along the wall, faces tight with discomfort. Team liaison officers whispered into comms, trying to determine whether to intervene or let the drivers air it out. Meanwhile, Vasseur's face had gone pale. He watched as his two-star drivers hurled accusations and wounds at each other, each sentence dragging the unity of the team further into disrepair. This was not a minor spat. It was an unfiltered clash of egos, ambition, and disappointment colliding with the force of a championship on the line. Everything that had been simmering beneath the surface for months was now exploding in real time. And beneath it all, the truth was unignorable. Ferrari had lost control. Hamilton was still furious, pacing like a caged lion. I've spent the season clawing back seconds, hunting down gaps, making every pit window count, and this is how we throw it all away, he growled. A speculative call from the pit wall and a driver who didn't trust his own gut. That's what's standing between me and another title. Charles, calmer now but still visibly shaken, gave a sad smile. Maybe I made a mistake. Maybe I should have shouted louder. Maybe I should have pitted no matter what they said. But don't pretend like you've never misjudged a situation before. We all have. The difference is, when you mess up, we rally behind you. When I mess up, you tear me apart. The silence that followed was absolute. Nobody moved. No one spoke. Even Vasseur, who had been preparing to speak, remained quiet. The room was thick with tension, regret, and the unmistakable sense that something irreparable had just happened. There would be no immediate resolution. The wounds were too fresh, the emotions too raw. But one thing was certain, the fragile alliance within the team had been shattered. From this point on, Ferrari would not just be fighting Red Bull and Mercedes on the track. They would be battling their own internal storm, one where trust was fading, patience was dwindling, and two titans of the sport were no longer walking the same path. Later that evening, in the buzzing atmosphere of the media pen, Lewis Hamilton finally approached the row of reporters waiting for him. The surrounding noise faded as microphones pushed toward his face and cameras zoomed in, anticipating something explosive. He didn't disappoint. His expression was that of a man holding back a storm, his jaw locked tight, his eyebrows drawn in, his posture rigid, every muscle tense with barely restrained fury. And when he began to speak, his voice carried a cold edge, sharper than any tire knife in the paddock. His sentences were clipped, economical, but packed with emotion. It's disgraceful, he said without blinking. We threw absolutely everything at this race. Preparation was flawless. The team gave me a great car. We nailed the strategy. My pace was consistent. I made the overtakes when I needed to. We put ourselves in a perfect position, and it all gets ripped away, not because of my mistake, not because of mechanical failure, but because another driver, whose team took a wild, reckless risk on the wrong tires, lost control right in front of me. That's not racing. That's gambling with lives. That's a casino, not a circuit. Every word landed with the weight of a punch. The assembled journalists, many of whom had followed Hamilton's entire career, had rarely seen him this raw, this unfiltered. It wasn't just a champion frustrated by a missed opportunity. It was a man who felt that the integrity of the sport had been compromised. His disappointment wasn't just personal. It was philosophical. He wasn't just angry about being taken out of contention. He was questioning the very principles of decision-making under extreme conditions. Just a few garages away, Charles Leclerc was facing a drastically different interrogation. The Ferrari driver, visibly shaken, stood surrounded by a swarm of cameras and recorders. Unlike Hamilton, his frustration was inward. The Monegasque driver's eyes were glassy, his voice soft, and every answer seemed to weigh heavier than the last. He knew the incident would define the narrative of the day, and he wasn't running from it. "I relied on the team," he said, his tone laced with regret. "They had the data. They had the weather radar. They had all the information. I listened. I followed the call. But maybe I should have pushed back. Maybe I should have demanded slicks. Or at least waited one more lap. I didn't want to be the hero, I just wanted to get the job done. But I ended up causing damage I never intended. I feel terrible for Lewis. He didn't deserve that. None of us did." Pressed further on whether he, as the driver, had the final say, Leclerc hesitated. "In theory, yes," he admitted. "But in moments like that, in the rain, with visibility dropping, and the track changing lap by lap, you lean on the pit wall. You trust their judgment. And today, that trust didn't work out. I couldn't control the car. It was sliding everywhere. Once I hit that patch, I was a passenger." What unfolded earlier on track was now being dissected in infinite detail across every medium imaginable. Television pundits debated tire strategy decisions, bringing in former race engineers and meteorologists to explain what Ferrari may have been seeing, or failing to see on the radar. Social media exploded into chaos. Hashtags like #FerrariFail, #HamiltonRobbed, #Leclerc under pressure, and #StrategyDisaster dominated the trending lists on X, Reddit, and TikTok. Some fans lashed out at Leclerc, accusing him of being mentally weak and too passive. Others defended him fiercely, arguing he was merely a pawn in Ferrari's increasingly erratic strategy choices. Even veteran drivers weighed in. Nico Rosberg called Ferrari's call incomprehensible. Jenson Button said it was the sort of decision that breaks trust between a driver and his engineers. Meanwhile, Martin Brundle highlighted the domino effect of such a mistake. One risky tire call from one team doesn't just affect them, it jeopardizes the races of everyone around them. In this case, it cost Lewis a potential podium, possibly even a win. Inside the Mercedes garage, the mood was grim but composed. The team's response to the media was carefully crafted, showing solidarity with Hamilton while avoiding escalation. "Today was deeply frustrating," the statement read. "Lewis was executing a brilliant race, and the incident was out of his hands. We understand his emotions, and we stand fully behind him as we analyze what comes next." Toto Wolff, usually calm and diplomatic, was reportedly furious behind the scenes, demanding an investigation into why certain teams had been allowed to stay out on intermediates when the track was clearly drying. Ferrari, by contrast, went radio silent. No team statement. No quotes from team principal Frederic Vasseur. No explanation for their decision. Not even a social media post. That silence only fueled speculation. Was the team trying to avoid admitting fault? Were they protecting Leclerc from further scrutiny? Or were they simply too stunned to respond to the mounting wave of criticism? Inside the paddock, the ripple effects of the crash were everywhere. Teams that had benefited from the chaos, like McLaren and Aston Martin, stayed silent, perhaps out of respect, perhaps out of fear of becoming the next target. Team principals huddled in private meetings. FIA officials were seen reviewing data and listening to team radios. There was even talk of a potential new rule to limit how long teams can stay out on intermediate tires once the track dries past a certain point, an emergency measure to prevent a repeat of such a dangerous miscalculation. And among the fans, debates turned personal. Was Hamilton right to be so angry, even if Leclerc had apologized? Did Leclerc deserve sympathy or condemnation? Was Ferrari once again proving themselves incapable of delivering under pressure in wet conditions? A criticism that has haunted them since the Vettel era? As the media storm intensified and the talking points multiplied, one thing became clearer with each passing hour: this wasn't just a racing incident. It was a reckoning. A moment when strategy, risk, weather, and human decision-making collided at over 300 kilometers per hour and sent shockwaves through the entire motorsport world. Hamilton's frustration would not fade easily. This was not a driver throwing a tantrum after a bad result. This was a 7-time world champion sounding the alarm that something deeper, more dangerous, was unfolding in the sport. And Leclerc, for all his talent and goodwill, now carried a scar that wouldn't heal quickly. He hadn't just spun out, he had taken someone else's race down with him. In F1, reputations are fragile. One moment of instability can redefine a career. And both drivers had just crossed a line, one as the victim, the other as the unintended cause. As night settled over the paddock, the debriefs stretched longer than usual. Engineers replayed the data. Drivers lay awake questioning every decision. Strategists recalculated their assumptions. And across the globe, fans braced for the next chapter, not just in the championship fight, but in the evolving drama of human error, team pressure, and emotional fallout that defines Formula One at its most brutal and beautiful. Behind the polished veneers of post-race interviews and the carefully rehearsed smiles exchanged in front of cameras, a far more turbulent and emotionally complex reality was taking shape. The incident in question, an apparently simple strategic miscommunication involving tire selection during variable weather conditions, was only the surface layer of a much deeper emotional rupture. What unfolded that afternoon wasn't merely a mistake on the pit wall or a momentary lapse in judgment. It was a seismic shift in the already fragile interpersonal dynamics between two of the most high-profile, ego-driven, and mentally intense drivers on the current Formula One grid, Lewis Hamilton and Charles Leclerc. Their relationship, always characterized more by competitive coexistence than any real camaraderie, now appeared dangerously close to irreparably fractured. What made this particular episode so significant wasn't just the strategic implications or the lost opportunity for championship points. It was the underlying symbolism. In an environment where team cohesion, mutual respect, and synchronized decision-making are often the unsung forces behind a successful campaign, the very public unraveling of communication and trust between these two titans of the sport sent shockwaves through the paddock. Engineers whispered, media outlets speculated, and fans dissected every word of the team radio transmissions. This was more than a failed tire call. This was the breakdown of a psychological alliance, a breach of an already thinly stretched professional truce. Formula One, by its very nature, is a sport where data rules all. Yet no algorithm can fully anticipate how a driver will react when they feel betrayed, unheard, or dismissed. And that is precisely what seemed to unfold here. When the rain came down, Hamilton, armed with the wisdom of experience, a legendary instinct honed through over a decade and a half in the sport, and the scars of past miscalculations, believed he knew what the correct choice was. He made the call to stay out, to trust the feel of the track and the rhythm of the moment. But the team hesitated. Or worse, ignored. And the consequence was immediate, brutal, and unforgettable. A spin. A ruined stint. A podium lost. But it wasn't just any lost podium. It was a chance for redemption, a critical momentum builder in a championship battle that has become one of the most tightly contested and emotionally volatile in modern memory. And in Hamilton's place, standing on that podium, beaming with the kind of joy only a long-denied dream can produce, was Nico Hülkenberg, the perennial underdog, the nearly man, the driver who had spent years as a symbol of unfulfilled promise, now finally tasting glory. For Hamilton, it was a psychological dagger. Not because he resents Hülkenberg personally, but because that moment was meant to be his. It should have been the headline that silenced the critics, the proof that he still has what it takes to win under pressure, to adapt, to rise. And instead, he was left with nothing but the haunting image of what could have been. The spray of champagne that wasn't his. The national anthem that played for someone else. The media horde gathered around another face, another story. Hamilton, ever composed in public, may have put on a brave face. But those closest to him know the look in his eyes when disappointment runs deep. And this was a wound. What's worse is that it didn't feel like an isolated incident. 4 months now, there have been whispers of friction between Hamilton and Leclerc. Clashing driving styles. Differing feedback to engineers. Conflicting priorities when it comes to upgrades and development paths. And now, those murmurs have grown louder, more defined. Some insiders suggest that Leclerc's influence within the team has been growing rapidly, particularly in the areas of strategic input and communication hierarchy. Others speculate that Hamilton has grown increasingly wary of the team's apparent willingness to take Leclerc's preferences at face value, while questioning his own. The seeds of division were already planted. This race simply accelerated their growth. And so, the ramifications are not limited to the drivers themselves. The entire team structure now finds itself under a microscope. From the race engineers to the strategists to the team principal, everyone is being scrutinized for their role in this growing rift. How are calls being made? Who gets priority in marginal conditions? Are both drivers receiving equal attention, support, and strategic deference? These questions, once whispered, are now shouted across social media, debated on TV panels, and parsed in obsessive detail by fans and analysts alike. And what of the psychological toll? For Hamilton, the weight of legacy has always been immense. Every race is not just about points but about proving, again and again, that he remains among the greatest to ever touch a steering wheel. But legacy is a fragile thing, easily damaged by internal politics and shifting team dynamics. And for a man who has always valued loyalty, emotional honesty, and collective strength, feeling isolated within his own garage could prove to be the beginning of a very dangerous spiral. Meanwhile, for Leclerc, the challenges are of a different kind. Rising in stature within the team, yes, but also under increasing scrutiny. With more influence comes more responsibility. If the team fractures, if results decline, if public opinion turns, Leclerc may find himself portrayed not as a leader, but as the divisive force who disrupted one of the most powerful team ecosystems in recent memory. That's a narrative no driver wants attached to their name, particularly one still trying to define his legacy in the shadow of Hamilton's towering achievements. From here on out, everything changes. Every decision, no matter how small, will be viewed through the prism of this moment. Team radio will be analyzed for signs of favoritism. Pit stop timing will be evaluated not just for efficiency, but for intent. Body language in the debrief room will be scrutinized like forensic evidence. And unless this team can find a way to rebuild the trust that has now very publicly crumbled, the remainder of the season may devolve into an internal power struggle disguised as a title campaign. Because make no mistake, in this championship, there is no margin for emotional disunity. Red Bull, Ferrari, and even the resurgent McLaren are not waiting for Mercedes to implode, they are actively pressuring them from every angle. Any slip, any internal delay, any hesitation caused by politics instead of performance, will be punished with brutal efficiency. And while the world watches the on-track battles unfold, the real war, the one for cohesion, for respect, for belief, will rage behind closed doors. Lewis Hamilton may have the resilience of a champion, the clarity of a philosopher, and the instincts of a predator, but even he is not immune to the psychological erosion that comes when trust is lost. And Charles Leclerc, for all his youth and brilliance, must now navigate the treacherous terrain of influence versus unity, ambition versus collaboration. The next races will not merely determine who stands atop the podium. They will define who controls the soul of this team, and perhaps, the outcome of the entire season. And long after the engines fall silent, long after the champagne is dried from the floor of the podium, one memory may persist in Hamilton's mind more than any other: the sight of another driver celebrating a dream he believed was his. A moment lost not to fate or to speed, but to silence, to hesitation, and to the crumbling of something that once resembled trust.